My name is Lara, an addiction advocate, is the best way I found to put it, I guess. I'm doing all this in hopes of creating a platform to discuss addiction and discuss where it comes from, brain pathways, genetic links, societal implications, generational trauma, family support for the family dealing with it, as well as how does the family support the person. Um, in addition to that, just the many ways of recovery, right? Um, but I also wanted this to be a safe space for those who have lost someone to addiction in whatever form that might come, to share that story of the loss of the person, share the stories, the good, the bad, the fun, the scary parts of that, uh, what might get lost when someone's labeled an addict, and for those who have struggled, who are currently struggling with addiction or mental health, to share their story. What started it, what kicked it off, what continued it going, what helped you to get sober, what's continuing to keep you stable, all of that. What was helpful, what wasn't, all of those things. Um, so that's kind of reason for all this. Uh, that being said, usual trigger warnings for today. We're going to talk about addiction. We're going to talk about overdose. We're going to talk about some drugs. Talk about some medical things. Yeah. Today, I kind of wanted to talk about kind of a celebrity issue, uh, so that we can kind of get an idea of the fact that even the rich and famous deal with this. It doesn't escape. Uh, they don't escape it simply because they maybe have money or they have influence or they have fame or anything like that. It's still there. Uh, I would say most of the people I work with, and it's mainly because I like working with nonprofit and I like working in community clinics, have been of the lower income area, and that's generally what I work with. And it's mainly because I enjoy that. But, and we oftentimes assume that those who deal with addiction are those who are of lower income or lower socioeconomic, which means those that have a lower income or lower social, lower societal, on the lower social totem pole, right? Uh, we think those are the ones that are going to end up with addiction, but that's not always the case, right? It's the soccer mom, it's the middle class soccer mom, it's the rich and famous celebrity, it's the guy with $1 million. It's anybody, right? It doesn't escape people. They can come from quote unquote the best homes ever and still end up with it, right? It doesn't discriminate. So it's important to keep that in mind. Uh, these stories come from so many different areas, and it's good to be aware of that. So the celebrity I'm going to talk about is one that's kind of been in the news quite a bit, because of his recent passing, and that's Matthew Perry, or Maddie, as he was known to his family and friends. Um, I chose him not just because he's kind of been in the news a lot, but I grew up with him. Um, Friends was huge for me. It was the show that I watched probably over and over growing up, and it's one that my husband and I watch every night, right? Even before his passing, it's a tradition for us. I think at this point we just put on Friends every night, and at this point we can quote literally every episode as the episode's playing. We can literally quote it as it goes. It was such a big thing. I think it started in '93, so I would have been like 3 years old, and then continued through the early 2000s. So I literally grew up on this show. So I grew up with him in my life. And most of his big stuff happened in my kind of formative years. So he was a big star growing up with him. So um, there was two celebrity deaths that I can honestly say I actually cried because I felt like losing almost like a friend or a close acquaintance. And that was Matthew Perry. And I actually might cry a little bit now, I'll admit. Matthew Perry and Robin Williams. And I think those, because they had an impact on my life, because I had a chance to get to know them. I'm going to cry a little bit. Because they had an impact on my childhood and early teen years, and even into my adulthood. Like I said, most of their movies, their TV shows, I continued to watch, and I continue to let my kids watch. My kids still watch Friends with us, um, Mrs. Doubtfire, things like that. Stuff a lot. So, all that extra addition in play. Um, uh, Matthew Perry was born on August 19th, 1969, and he died on October 28th, 2023. It's hard to believe it's been almost 6 months now, I think. He was both American and Canadian. He starred, and this is not cumulative, this is just a small selection of the things he starred in, but Friends, Studio 60, Fools Rush In, Whole Nine Yards. He wrote Mr. Sunshine. He had reoccurring roles in The Good Wife, The Good Fight. He had Emmy nominations for The East Wing and the Ron Clark Story. But again, this is not all of it, right? I think he's best known for his role as Chandler in Friends. And one of the ones that I know I hear about a lot is The Whole Nine Yards. They're two of the biggest ones that we know about, that I hear about a lot. He was originally born in the U.S., in Massachusetts, to Suzanne Morrison and John Perry. And I'm going to quote, I actually did listen to and read his autobiography to prep for this. Friends, Lovers, and The Big Terrible Thing, which if you ever get a chance to read, I highly suggest it. It's awesome. But I'll quote it quite a bit in this as I go about. But to quote him in the book, he says both his parents were famous in their own right? So his mom, she was, I don't want to get this wrong, but I feel like he said the assistant to the Canadian Prime Minister. I probably got that wrong. But and then his dad was as an actor as well, and had a lot of his own famous roles. His parents separated when he was a year old, and then he went to live in Canada with his mom and grandparents for quite some time. And he feels like this is kind of where a lot of his mental health stuff starts. And I love that in the book he's very open about the fact that his substance use relates back to his mental health. Like it relates back to his struggle with abandonment, attachment, his struggle with not feeling good enough, not ever, always looking for something more, that kind of thing. He felt like he was constantly seeking something that he just couldn't quite get there on. And I feel like he does a really good job of being clear about that. And so if you get a chance to read it again, it's on Audible, and he's the one who reads it, so it's always so great to listen to his voice. Although you can tell that he used cigarettes throughout his life, so you can hear that in his voice. But he lived in Canada with his mom and his grandparents for several years until his mom remarried to his stepdad. And he does speak well of his parents. He recognizes that there's mental health, but he says very clearly, I don't blame my parents. He says that he feels like they were overall good parents, even if they made mistakes along the way. He mentions that he was a colicky baby, and anybody's ever dealt with a colicky baby, it's rough, right? That means they are screaming and crying all night long. Sometimes you don't sleep for weeks on end, right? It's rough. So for a parent who's dealing with that, it can be incredibly difficult to get any kind of sleep, to get any kind of respite. And at that point, a lot of times parents are looking for anything they can to get a break. And I guess the pediatrician or doctor or whoever actually prescribed him barbiturates. Again, this was the late 1960s, early 1970s, right? We didn't really know for sure the effects these things could have on developing brains. We're starting to learn it now, but we didn't know then. And at that point, his parents were just looking for some kind of respite, and the doctor prescribed it, right? So they figured it's safe, and they gave it to him. And we don't know for sure that that's had an effect on his addiction later, but it could have very easily started his brain off and enjoying depressants, right? Because barbiturates are part of the depressant family, as I talked about in episode 4. But he, like I said, he does a really good job of taking accountability for his own choices, recognizing that his parents made the best decisions that they could in the moments when they did. But he also speaks well of his stepdad. Says his mom went through several relationships, and he always struggled to feel like his stepdad was going to leave. No, not stepdad, but his mom's boyfriends were always going to take off, right? But he does speak well of his stepdad, and he feels like it was a good home, but he always kind of felt like an outsider. Like he didn't quite belong because like mom kind of created this new family, and then he ended up having 4 younger siblings from mom and stepdad. And it kind of always felt like, oh, well, mom doesn't need me anymore, right? But during those formative years before stepdad came along, he did spend a lot of his time taking care of mom. Mom was sad, mom was stressed, mom was dealing with a lot of things. And so he spent most of his time trying to make mom laugh and happy. And he feels like that's kind of where he learned to be the comedian, right, in the room. He speaks a lot about focusing on how can I take care of her? How can I make her happy, right? Kind of learning to bury his own emotions to take care of her, which I think a lot of parents of divorced kids, that tends to be what we do, right? That we kind of take on that role of how can I take care of my parent and how can I make them happy? And that's kind of what he did. And then it kind of snowballs into his adulthood, into his teen years and his adulthood of like, I got to make this girl laugh, got to make her smile, and that's how I find. That's how I'm then good and useful to other people, is by making them smile and laugh. And he says that he deals a lot with abandonment. He speaks to feeling like an unaccompanied minor. He speaks very vividly of an experience where he was 5 years old and put on an airplane to go from Canada with his mom to go visit his dad, and he was literally an unaccompanied minor, right? So anybody who's dealt with this, it literally is mom puts you on a plane in one spot, right? And they give you kind of like a stewardess that's basically like your kind of guardian for the moment, and she kind of guides you through it, right? And then you're put on the plane and you're by yourself, but you're essentially by yourself, and then you get off the plane and meet dad, right? And it's a good idea, but it also creates the problem of then, like, if you're ever afraid, if the plane is scary, if you don't know what's going on, like, there's really no one for you to talk to reach out to hold your hand, to give you a hug, to make you feel better, especially at 5 years old, right? At 5 years old and you're on an airplane, it can be scary. And so that fear was always kind of there. But he describes, like, once he saw that beautiful view of California, he was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna see dad. And so that kind of helped him feel better. He was able to kind of look down and be like, oh, someone loves me, someone down there is gonna get me, and I'll be okay. And that's kind of why he always picked a house with you. And that's kind of like, as I'm going down, I know that my parent is going to be there. So, and there was, and that, as well as the divorce between the parents, kind of created that fear of abandonment, which again kind of went into there. And he describes his addiction as kind of always trying to fill those holes. Like, he's like, I always felt like I was going to get left behind, and the easiest way to not have that was to push other people away. But then I still felt like I was missing something. So the best way to handle that was to use substances, whether that was alcohol or opiates or what have you to then fill those missing holes. He did live with mom and stepdad until he was about 15 years old. And he started having issues when he was about 10. When he started having behavior issues, he started acting out. He was stealing, smoking. His grades were bad. He describes beating up the future Prime Minister of Canada. He started drinking alcohol at age 14. He says he does it with the Murray brothers, who went on to do some acting as well. But at that point, it was kind of like, dude, you gotta work some things out. And that's when he moves to live with his dad. During that time, though, he became like the top tennis player in Ottawa. Like, he was the top, and I didn't even know this till he passed away. I was like, oh, he's a tennis player? That's amazing, right? But he was like the top tennis player, and that was kind of his way of like coping, was tennis, along with everything else, right? Along with the substances. But he would go and he would play, and he would beat everybody, and that would kind of play into that perfectionistic feeling of like, oh, this is how I can get people to love me, is to be the best, which helped until he then moved, until he moved to California, where he was no longer the top player, and competition kind of blew him out of the water, and he stopped playing for the most part. And then he says at that point he kind of works on becoming an expert at drinking. Concept is, if you spend 10,000 hours at anything, you can be an expert at it. Feels like he's an expert at drinking. As far as, I'll kind of go into what his substance use actually looked like. So he started drinking alcohol at about age 14. He had a realization around 21. He was at a kind of like a party or an after party, and he had a realization that he had this creeping feeling of needing more alcohol. He's like, they go to a bar, and they're drinking, and everybody's just kind of getting drunk and whatnot, and then they go to a friend's house afterwards, and she doesn't have any alcohol, and everybody else seems to be fine with that. Everyone else is like, that's totally fine, no big deal, like, we don't need more alcohol, we're good for the night. Matthew, on the other hand, is kind of doing this thing of like, but I need more, right? He has this like creeping feeling in the back of his neck, like in the back of his head, like, but I need more. Like, I feel like I need more. Why do I need more? And that was kind of this kind of moment of like, there's something off. Maybe that's not how I want to feel. As compared to how he felt when he first got drunk at 14, where he felt this euphoric feeling of like, just like, oh my God, I feel good. All of a sudden, like this warm feeling throughout your body, and it's just like, oh my God, I feel so good, and I feel so calm, and all of the crap in my life is gone, and all those holes that I feel are just filled. All of a sudden, it's like, wait, those holes are filled, but now why do I need so much more? And it's kind of this realization. At about age 24, he's starting to miss auditions. He's drinking so much that he's kind of letting his acting career kind of falter. But then he's doing Friends, but then he actually manages to get Friends, right? He's starting to kind of fall off. But then his accountant comes and he's like, hey, by the way, you're out of money, right? And he's like, oh shit, I probably should figure some shit out. And so and that's when he ends up on some weird show, and I can't even remember what the name of it is, but it's it's not Studio 60. It's some weird show. And it's like set in the future for baggage handlers or something. It was weird. And he gets a callback for that, and he gets set up on that show, and he's like, and so he's like, great, cool, at least I'm making some money, right? That's what I need. And then Friends pops up, and he's like, oh shit, and he almost misses the audition for that. He almost misses the chance to be on that. He reads for that. He doesn't read for it, but he reads the the script for it. And he's like, oh my God, I'm Chandler. This would be perfect, right? But because he had taken this crap job because he was out of money, because he was drinking so much, he almost missed out on it. Because he was, trying to think of the right word, he was committed to this other show. He couldn't then go read for Friends because he was committed to this other show. Luckily enough, somebody on the Friends show figured out that this other one was probably not going to go anywhere, and so he was kind of open to be able to be non-committed. Had him come in, read for Chandler. They were like, yeah, absolutely, dude, right? Which I can't imagine anybody else playing him. That was perfect. But so he gets this, and then he's on the movie of Saving Sarah, and he decides to jump on the jet ski, because why not, right? And go flying. And of course, he's half drunk because he always is. And he describes it as like he turned the wheel and the jet ski stopped and he didn't. And so he went flying over it and caused serious injuries to himself. And that's the first time he got the taste of Vicodin. Okay. And he describes like Oxycontin and those things as like warm honey going through your veins. And so he got the taste of Vicodin, and he was like, "Oh my God, this is even better than alcohol! Holy shit, this is the thing, right?" And so within a very short period of time, he's now taking 55 pills a day, which is a lot. Is a lot. And this is 1997 when the jet ski accident happens. So then by May of 2000, he now has pancreatitis. He's in a lot of pain. He's really, really sick. Can't figure out why. Goes to the hospital, and they're like, "Dude, you got pancreatitis. Like, you fucked up your system. Like, you done, right?" And then during when he's taping Fools Rush In, the movie, he experiences Dilaudid. That's where he gets the chance to experience Dilaudid, and he's like, "This is amazing." And he's like, "I felt close to God that day." So he's getting these experiences, and a lot of it's because he's able to convince doctors that he's in pain, even when he's really not, right? He's like, "Oh, I'm in so much pain, this pancreatitis or this or that's causing me a lot of pain," which is a lot of the whole doctor shopping, right? It's, I feel pain even when I don't, and doctors, especially in the 90s, early 2000s, were giving out this stuff like candy. They were willing to. Jumping, and Fools Rush In was in like 1998, I believe. And that's when he gets in a car accident. I don't know if any of you guys remember that one. And he's high on Dilaudid. So he ends up, he's driving home in the Porsche. He's driving home in a Porsche, and crashes. He like veers to avoid like a delivery truck, and ends up going down a stairwell into a home and like into somebody's front yard. I think he hits the house. I don't remember for sure. I think he kind of hits the house, but it's an accident, right? And he does the right thing. He sticks around. He talks to the cops and everything. But of course, because he does, there's pictures of it, right? And it ends up all over the news and the whole day, right? But obviously, right, this is where people are like, interesting, what's going on? But as you can see, these are starting to cause issues, which are part of those diagnoses that we make when it comes to substance use. Like, are we getting consequences, and are we continuing to use despite these consequences, right? Now he's got physical consequences, right? He's got pancreatitis. He's getting in car accidents. He's losing out on job opportunities, things like that, right? These are obvious signs. He's building up a tolerance. He's having withdrawal symptoms. Things like this are continuing to show up, showing that he's continuing to get worse over time. And some of these things are happening very quickly, right? In 2001, he kind of has this like wake up call a little bit, with a girlfriend that he's seeing at the time, and realizes, I need help. And so at that point, he's filming Friends, and I believe he's still filming Serving Sarah. And he says, "No, we're done. I need to Twitter, and I might mix up some of these dates. I apologize for those that you know him a little bit better. I'm trying to just kind of get the basics of it so we kind of understand that. If I mix it up, please correct me. I, again, open to correction. He ends up in rehab. And at the time, he's taking Vicodin, methadone. He's on cocaine and alcohol. Like, and the sad part is his wake up call isn't even like, oh, I should probably get clean. It's he actually thought he was going to die the next day. Like, he thought he was like, I screwed up enough. I'm going to die. I probably should like not do the thing anymore. So he stops everything. He actually ended up getting sued for stopping the filming of the movie because like it ended up offsetting the time frame of when it was supposed to get released, which to their view made it so that they didn't make as much money. He did try to make up for it by doing, like a tour for publication and all of that stuff, but you can only do so much. So in 2011, and then you kind of see a little bit of a break in it, but a lot of this is still during the time when Friends is being aired. It seems like he kind of gets sober, but it's hard to tell, right? It seems like he probably just kind of goes quiet for a little while. But in 2011, he lobbied with Congress in support of funding for drug courts. So I want to touch on that really quick. So drug courts are a system for those who are generally nonviolent offenders, and it's a way for them to get their sentences or their charges reduced. It's a great program. It's amazing. It's super helpful. It also tends to kind of redirect them from incarceration to treatment. I work a lot with drug courts, and there's multiple different kinds. Each state kind of has their own version. There's also federal ones that are available, but I love them because I feel like you end up with parole officers that are more geared towards the substance use side. They understand it better. They're in it because they care about the substance use. They care about those that are dealing with it. They understand it better. They generally have more training and experience in that. Same with the judges that you're dealing with. They tend to understand it better. And again, we're working towards a decriminalization of that because unfortunately with substance use, you end up with a lot of charges, right? That can be stacked onto each other. If you're found with a certain amount, right, we can, even if it's for you, you can get charged with distribution, and then you're charged with paraphernalia because you've got the parts that you use to do the drugs with. You can get charged with use, holding, all the right. And these can just stack on, and then you've got this long list of charges. We want to kind of take a look at that, which was his point. Like, I want to decriminalize this, especially for nonviolent offenders. In 2013, he was given an award for opening Perry House, which is a rehab center in Malibu. Unfortunately, I think he ended up having to close that. But I love the idea, right? In 2018, this is where he opens the book. He ended up with gastrointestinal perforation. He ended up 2 weeks in a coma, a colostomy bag for 9 months, and he had a 2% chance of survival. If you get a chance to listen to this book and read it, like the way he describes this, holy crap, right? He was in a sober living. So this is why I say he wasn't sober completely during this time frame. I think he just managed to stay out of the media to some degree. But he was in a sober living. He ended up in like just extreme pain. And the friend that was there with him was like, we got to get you to the hospital. Took him to the hospital. They figured out what was going on. And then he just ended up vomiting things. And it just exploded essentially. And then that ended up going into his lungs. It was bad. Like, it was really bad. Basically, his family and friends were flown in just saying, you might as well say your goodbyes. The chances of him making it are pretty slim. Like, even the hospital that he was at didn't want to take care of him because they didn't want the death of Matthew Perry. And so they were like, well, do we really want to? I don't know. And so they had to like transfer him to another hospital, and then that hospital was, we don't really want him. But then like the ventilation system they had to put him on, they had to put it in this hospital, and it was a weird agreement they had to set up. It was funky. It's where like you would think being a celebrity would be helpful, but like he goes through this quite a bit where it's like because of his drug use, like some doctors would stop taking care of him because one, because of his drug use and he would keep kind of using when he shouldn't have been. But two, because they're like, I don't want the death of this like major star. I don't want I don't want his death on my hands. Like I don't want to deal with that. So they would be like, we're not helping you. We're not doing it. I wipe my hands of it. He describes one doctor like literally booking it down for 5, 6 flights of stairs to get out of the situation. He's like, nope, not doing it. I'm not going to be involved in that. So they were like, we're out. In 2020, he's back in another rehab in Switzerland. He's on 1,800 milligrams of oxy and ketamine. And which he didn't tell them about some of that stuff. And so then he got propofol during the surgery, stopped his heart for 5 minutes. Like, and again, use despite consequences, right? Like that's one of the things that like you're about to go into this surgery, and this is one of those times where you probably shouldn't be using, and you should probably be sharing all this information. You're choosing not to, and you're like, oh Lord, bro, don't do that. And then in 2022, he says like he's in another rehab facility, but he kind of adds it up, and he says he thinks he's spent like $9 million on his addiction overall, like 14 stomach surgeries from the gastrointestinal perforation, 15 different rehab stays, therapy twice a week for 30 years, and then like 6,000 AA meetings, which even my AA meetings are free. But in 2022, at that point, he states he's been clean for about 18 months. But we hope that's the case. But it's hard to say, right? How clean was he? So that's kind of the timeline of his addiction for the most part. One thing I did want to touch on is he talks about when he knew Bruce Willis from when talk about the whole 9 yards. And he does some partying with him, and he sees how Bruce Willis is able to kind of like go crazy and drink and use some things and whatnot, and then just stop when he wants to. And he makes it very clear that there's a difference between partiers and addicts. And I mentioned the movie Pleasure Unwoven in my episode 2, when we talk about the disease of pleasure. There's part in there that describes very well the difference between like users and abusers kind of thing, right? Where there's those of us that can go ahead and drink on the weekends and we're fine and we can stop. There's those of us that might abuse it a little bit. So there's users, there's abusers, and there's addicts, right? We might go ahead and abuse it a little bit, right? We might use more than we should here and there, but we can stop if we really want to. And then there's the addicts, where once they're hooked, they're hooked. And like I described before, we build up a tolerance, we continue using despite consequences. We let our entire lives fall apart in the process of it. Like things just go to shit very quickly and very easily for them. Because their brain kicks in that dopamine and they are out the door. There is no fixing it, right? And it doesn't take much for relapse. And he says this a couple times. He says all it takes is something to relapse. He doesn't say like this specific things. He just says something, right? And that's all it ever took, was just something to relapse. But in touching on like something was usually something with mental health, right? A lot of it was anger that he turned inward to himself, right? Like if anything went wrong, he assumed it was him, assumed it was his fault. Again, he was trying to fill those holes, fears of abandonment. And he's like, I was always trying to like find excitement, but unable to appreciate it. Like one of his dreams was producing a movie that did really well, and the whole 9 yards does do really well, right? It's like the sensation. But he's in such a throw of addiction in that point that he actually sits there and like kind of knocks it in the process. It's like, oh, I did a terrible job. I shouldn't have done that. Blah blah blah. People are gonna hate me. They're not even gonna let me see the movie because it's gonna be that bad. I'm not even gonna be allowed in movie theaters. And he jokes about it and says, I should have saved that deprivation of myself for the whole 10 yards. But he talks about just not being able to appreciate the excitement that I so desperately want. And it's kind of that self-deprecation that we do. He constantly was chasing fame and hoping it would fix him, and then being super frustrated when it didn't, right? Like he finally got the whole 9 yards, or he finally got friends and hoping it would fix him, and hoping he would get mom's attention. And he talks about that. He's like, I was always hoping that mom would finally be proud of me or would finally give me that attention. He talks about that time before stepdad came in where he was always wanting mom's attention. And it didn't matter how much he did, how much he made her laugh, or any of that. She would always leave to go do something else. And she was always that one that like walked into the room and lit up the room, right? It didn't matter what he did. If she was in the room, she took all the attention. And he's like, I kind of want mom to be able to give some of that attention to me, or to feel like I'm as good as her. And he felt he just could never get there. And so no matter what the fame he got, he never felt like she gave him enough attention. But he admits at that point that he doesn't feel like there's ever a chance that she could have given him enough. She could have given him all the attention in the world and it still wouldn't have been enough. Because it was like always seeking a little bit more. And always feeling like he could never measure up to his parents. With his mom's beauty, his dad's charisma, it just never felt like enough. He does describe some impotence issues in his childhood, or his adolescence, where he's like, I tried to have sex with a girl, didn't work out, couldn't get it up. And then for the next several years, he assumed he just never could, until a very sweet girl at age 19 was able to kind of fix that for him. But that also added to his issues with women of like, I suck at life. Like, I'm terrible. I can't even do this right. He did have a great relationship with God. He talks about that a lot. But he also says at some points, I just kind of wanted to tell God to go fuck himself for making things so hard for him. It's like, I don't understand this. Why does this have to be so hard? And like I said, during some of that time where you don't hear a whole lot of his updates between like 2001 and like 2011, we do have some from friends. He does talk about a lot of the changes in his weight. He says end of 5, beginning of 6, you can see a weight change, which I didn't notice until I went back and looked at this. It's during that time where Chandler kind of proposes to Monica. Monica proposes to Chandler. Kind of how you look at it. But he's wearing the same outfit in the last episode and the first episode, and you can see there's a huge weight change. He says that's during a time of a relapse. Says end of season 3, he's super thin. If you look at that, you can see there's like a beach episode. You can see he's super thin and like the clothes are kind of hanging off of him. And he admits it makes it really hard for him to go back and watch the show, because he can see the progression or the change of his addiction through the years, because he can see the weight change. He's like, oh, well, that's where I was using alcohol. That's where I was on opiates. This is where I was doing that. This is where I was doing that. Oh, this is when they had to send me the rehab because all of a sudden I'm in freaking another state, right? Like he has to, like, it's all basically just kind of like re-triggering and reminding him of all that he went through with that. And he also talks about like panic attacks, because again, coming into that not feeling good enough, we also come with perfectionism, and he wanted to be perfect. And he always felt like if that joke didn't land exactly the way it needed to, and he didn't get the exact laughs he was looking for, then it wasn't good enough. And it was like that panic of, oh my God, they hate me, right? And so that's always hard, because then he's like listening for those laughs too. So I do, I touched a lot on his addiction, so I do want to touch on his sobriety. He talks about a moment where he did see where he feels like he saw heaven and spoke to God in his kitchen, of all places, right? But sometimes, when we hit rock bottom, we hit rock bottom. It's really odd places. It's after his dad and a sober companion are living at the house. He's working on trying to get sober, but he still has some meds hiding in his room. and he went ahead and took them anyway. And then the next morning he wakes up and he realizes, I don't have any more of this, but now I'm going to detox off of that. And as I said before, detoxing off of depressants is very, very dangerous. And he realized that, and he was like, oh shit, like if I don't get more of this, or if I don't do something, I could very well die. So now I have to come clean, which required them to then go to the doctor and do all these things. While he's sitting there waiting for possible methadone or something to help with it, he starts to feel very sick, and that's when he feels like he kind of sees God. He has this kind of like awakening moment of like, oh, shit, I probably should figure this out. And God kind of speaks to him, and he's like, all right, cool, like I'm gonna figure this out. I'm gonna try. And he felt like in the moment, he's like, I didn't want to die. I felt like if this had killed me, it would have killed the wrong person. I wasn't me yet. Wasn't the person I wanted to be yet. And that was kind of that turning point for him. He wasn't completely sober after that. He still had his relapses, but it was kind of his moment of, I'm not the person I want to be yet. I'm not ready to let this kill me. I need to make some changes. And I describe that when I'm doing therapy as kind of like that light switch flips on, and it's like all of a sudden this, oh shit, this isn't, I don't like this life. I need to fix something. And I think that's kind of what that was for him. And he talks about his work with other addicts and helping them. And he talks about how helping that light come back on in their eyes as they're kind of getting sober and figuring out their life and kind of becoming themselves again. He's like, that's all God to me. Like I see God in those moments. And he says it's okay to kind of look at that difficult road and be pissed. Like people think that because an addict all of a sudden realizes they can be sober, that they should just be happy. And he's like, no, it's okay to like look at this difficult road ahead and realize that now I've got to figure out how to stay sober for the rest of my life. And it's okay to be pissed. It's okay to be mad that this is going to be hard. He also states in there, he's like, if you put anything in front of sobriety, you'll lose that thing anyway. That's a direct quote from him. And I feel like that's incredibly important because a lot of times people are like, oh, well, I got out of treatment. I can go ahead and put all these things ahead of that. But a lot of times those things that kept you sober are going to be the things that keep you sober going forward. So if that means an AA meeting, if that means going to the gym, if that, whatever that means for you to keep you sober, you need to keep doing those things, because if you put them on the back burner for something else, chances are that thing that you were putting first, you're going to lose anyway. So continuing to put that sobriety as a priority, because it's just like mental health, right? If we all of a sudden are like, oh, I'm not going to take my pills because I need to do the X, Y, and Z, at some point our mental health is going to suffer and we're going to lose whatever. Same thing with physical health, right? All of a sudden, oh, I'm not going to take care of my diabetes because I got to go to work. At some point, the diabetes is going to flare up. And we're not going to go to work anyway. It's not really going to help. He says that helping others became his sobriety, which I've seen very often. People work in the system. They work in detox centers. They work in AA. They work in any of these places to kind of remind themselves where they came from, keeps them kind of up on their sober skills, anything like that. It just kind of helps them stay stable. Again, he advocated for rehab. He advocated for the National Drug Court professionals. He received the Champion of Recovery Award in 2013 from the president. He does talk about, in that last chapter, he talks about, I don't have another sobriety in me. If I started to slip, I'd go hard. I'd just go all in. And I've heard this from a number of clients. It's like, I slip, I'm going hard. I can't come back from this again. I don't know if I can do it. Or I know that if I do this again, my body's just going to give out. He does talk a lot about the concept of overdosing. Just kind of scary when you think about how he passes. He talks about a couple of different movies and seeing how those people in the movies passed away. They just kind of breathe and they let go. He never does, as far as we know, past the 2022, he never does go back to opiates. And a lot of that is because he never wanted to end up with a permanent colostomy bag, which I guess is a reason not to. But if you're gonna find a reason, I guess that's a reason. Um, uh, but the less fun part, as far as his death goes, he's found unresponsive in his hot tub by his assistant. She had left to run errands. He'd been fine. He'd actually played pickleball earlier that afternoon. She left for a few hours and then came back, found him unresponsive. Uh, the medical examiner's report states acute effects of ketamine. So it means like short-term effects of ketamine. It indicates it was a combination of the buprenorphine, which he was on to keep him off the opiates, right? Drowning and coronary artery disease. The drowning was due to like he kind of passed out, went to sleep, and then went under the water. And the ketamine had an effect on his heart, and probably all the other shit he used throughout his life, right? He was receiving ketamine assisted psychotherapy at the time, which is a thing that we now do. A lot of people found it very helpful. But the last session was like 10 days prior. And ketamine has a half-life of like 3 to 4 days. Or, yeah, of like 3 to 4 hours. And so the levels don't match what was in his body at the time. So, I mean, kind of, do what you will with that, but it does sound like it was an overdose from what you can tell. I mean, it does say that alcohol, methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, PCP, fentanyl, all the other things he did use regularly were not detected. But as we've seen before, when things stopped working, he kind of transitioned to something else, right? So if he found that ketamine was working, he could have gone to that. And I know when I lost my sister, even though I suspected it was an overdose, there was such a huge part of me that wanted to believe it wasn't. And I think with him, I felt the same way. I was like, please don't let it be the case, right? Because you want to believe they were clean, you want to believe they were sober. And I've lost past clients to this too, where like they had gotten so clean, they were doing so well, and then we find out like a year or two later they passed up an overdose, and it's so painful for those ones because we feel like, oh, they got better, they were doing so well, and then they went back and used again, and we lost them, and it's like, oh, but they were there, they were good, they were okay, and then we lost them, and it's so painful and it's so hard. But it's just a reminder that like addiction doesn't go away; it's there. And overdose is always a possibility. Right? I did find one article from US Weekly magazine that states some possible abusive behavior. But everything it said in there was like, couldn't get comments, couldn't get actual evidence from it. I mean, obviously, like, he was rich, they could have covered it up, right? But I don't want to wash over the fact that that definitely is possible. And he does even describe himself as kind of an asshole when he was high or using. And when people are in the throes of their addiction, they can be dicks. This is definitely possible. So I don't want to wash over that for any victims that maybe did have to deal with that. Domestic violence, aggression can definitely come with this, whether in the middle of it, whether detoxing, things like that. Like I said, there was no evidence that I could actually find for it. A lot of it was like, we couldn't get actual evidence of it. But, just something to keep in mind of like, even the people that we absolutely love and think are amazing could, have those behaviors because of their addictions. But overall, like I said, I grew up with this guy in Friends and the movies. I loved him. I thought he was amazing, and he really did try. I mean, he did the therapy, he did the treatments, he did the sober livings, he did all the things, and it still just had its control. And unfortunately, even with all the people that loved him, that addiction still had more control over him. And I think, again, that's the important part, is like all the money, like he said, he spent like $9 million on this. Like, it doesn't make it go away. still there. And as I always say, addiction is buried because of the shame, right? We hide it. It doesn't help when it's in spotlight. People are taking pictures, right? But we need to shed light on where it comes from, what happens, the mental health pieces behind it, what helps, what doesn't help. And I'm sure paparazzi is in your face, probably one of the things that doesn't help, right? But let's make these conversations loud, uh, share our stories so society can see, addicts as people. Like, he was a person. He had a family that loved him, friends that loved him. He was a human, right? Uh, People need to understand the losses that come with these. But make sure to subscribe. If you have suggestions or topics that you think I need to cover, or if you would like to um, share your story or tell me your story, you can find me on Facebook, on TikTok, or on my website at A Family Addiction. Yeah, tell me your story. Make this loud. Thank you.